There's a lot I want to cover in this interview in terms of some of the policy issues, but I want to start by talking about your background, because it's a very interesting background that I'm not sure a lot of people in South Florida necessarily understand. I'm sure they know it in your home district, but a little less so here. First off, we're both from Brooklyn.
Yes,
I grew up in Bay Ridge, you grew up in Crown Heights, to a single mom with you and 2 other kids.
Yes.
Talk to me about what those early days were like for you and what you remember, and basically the beginning of your life and what your story is.
Well, I mean, look, I wouldn't be here without my mother. My mother did so much for me. She sacrificed a lot to help me get the best education I could. My mom was a school choice mom before school choice was a thing. She moved me out of public school very early, and then made a ton of sacrifices to put me in private school so I could get the best education possible. She was a tough lady. She's tough. She was strict. She did the very best job she could do for me and for my sisters. And so I wouldn't be in the position I am today without my mother. Leaving New York was a decision as a young kid, was basically like, I'm going to go somewhere else. I'm going to go far away. I kind of looked at Florida, looked at a couple other states that I figured I was going to go to get my college education. But I can't stress enough, growing up in New York was hard upbringing, but my mother did everything. When you say
it was hard, what was the hardest part of it?
Well, we grew up poor, number one. In my neighborhood in Crown Heights, Brooklyn at the time, that was during the crack epidemic. I remember sometimes I was going to baseball practice in the morning, and you would be walking down the street to go to the train station. You see crack vials all over the street corners in the early mornings before people could come out and clean them up from the night before. My mayors in New York were Ed Koch, David Dinkins, and Rudy Giuliani. So I remember when Rudy took over, because the streets became so much safer, because Rudy made sure that officers were on the streets every single day, as opposed to what was happening in previous administrations, where the cops were basically in their precincts and not actually walking the beat and holding low-level crime accountable.
Can I ask you what happened to your father?
My parents just never married. You know, things just didn't work out.
Do you have a relationship with him at all?
Yeah, we do have a relationship. We talk periodically, but I just didn't grow up with my dad.
Okay. Obviously, when you came to Florida as a young man, you did have some troubles with the law yourself.
Yeah.
You were arrested, I think, when you were 18 on a marijuana charge. What can you tell me about that?
Stupid decision. Honestly, I was walking down the street. I was leaving a party. Officers came up, asked me if I would empty my pockets. I said, yes, of course. I had a dime bag of marijuana in my pocket. That's the story. And so, you know, it's tough, because there was a lot of decisions that I wish I could go back and redo from those early years. Like 18, 19, and 20 were really tough years for me. Made a lot of bad decisions that I regret. But in life, you don't just, you're not who you are at the lowest point in your life. What you do is you decide to just, push forward and try to make sure you make better decisions in the future. And I would tell people, if you examine my life since 20 years old, my life has really been a story of redemption.
And I want to talk about that redemption arc, but before I get there, I just want to be clear on a couple of things with regard to your arrest.
Sure.
The charge itself that was listed in court documents was possession with intent to distribute. Mm-hmm. Your ex-wife, or your first wife at the time, gave an interview recently in which she said, we had this neighbor who sold drugs, and they, meaning you and the neighbor, got close. Byron thought that was his path to fix his money situation. He was making bad choices. It was never a sense of why he did it. I had a level of concern. I had to worry, what if he got arrested? Your ex-wife says that you were actually not just possessing drugs, but you were selling small amounts of drugs.
Yeah, it was bad decisions.
So you
and
were.
I can't undo that decision.
So you were selling.
Yeah, for a period of time, low-level amounts, terrible decisions. Jim, like I told you, those years of my life, there are a lot of things I wish I could undo. I wish I could, but I can't do that. I was a youth leader for 12 years in my community in Southwest Florida. And what we always told the young kids is that when you mess up, you make up, but you never give up. And I messed up early on. It's one of the reasons why I spent so much of my other years in Southwest Florida mentoring young kids, serving in my church, helping them make sure they don't make the decisions that I made when I was 18. And
you had another incident with a fraud charge that related to a bank debit card, or
yes.
And again, it was something that happened when I think you were 20. When you were 18, the case ended up going through a diversion program. You stayed good for a year. I think you paid a fine. The charges were ultimately dropped. With the fraud charge, I think it's not clear because the records were sealed and then expunged.
Right.
In both those cases, it seemed that you received some mercy from the courts, either through a pretrial diversion program or by having recognizing that you were a youthful offender, having your record sealed and eventually expunged. There has been some concern raised that, for instance, you're the sponsor of the DC Crimes Bill,
Yes.
which would overhaul some of the criminal justice for youthful offenders in the District of Columbia area. And there are those who believe that the stance you're taking now is hypocritical, given that some of the very grace that you were shown in cases in Florida, you would deny to people in similar situations in the District of Columbia.
Well, listen, first let me talk to the DC Crimes Act. I'm a proud sponsor of it. The problem in the District of Columbia is that they were treating 24-year-olds as if they were juveniles. And look, I will never say that what the decisions I made when I was very young were right decisions or smart decisions. They were terrible decisions, desperate decisions. But in Florida, I had to face the music as an adult. In DC, they were letting 24-year-olds be tried as juveniles. That's not right, Jim. It's one of the reasons why juvenile crime in DC is shooting through the roof. So let me be clear with you on this one. So what we did in DC is we said, if you're 24 years old, if you're 20 years old, if you're 19 years old, you're going to be tried as an adult in the DC system, not as a child.
Except I'm not sure your description of what the impact of the law is accurate. From what I understand, it doesn't necessarily mean that 18 to 24-year-olds would be tried as juveniles. It would allow people in that range, in certain cases, to have their convictions sealed and receive more flexible sentencing options at a judge's discretion.
Jim, I'm just telling you that's not true. What we did in the DC Crimes Act is we made sure that people who were of that age, people who are the age of maturity, the age of adulthood,
the age that you were,
tried. Exactly.
The age that you were.
And in Florida, I had to face the music as an adult, not as a juvenile. Now, Florida does have laws around diversion, being able to seal records, and yes, those were things that were afforded to me. And I look back on those days and I say, you know what, that helped me restart my life, so be it. But in DC, it was very different. In DC, they were trying 23-year-olds as juveniles, Jim. And you can't do that, because what ends up happening—
Not all 23-year-olds were being tried as juveniles.
But enough of them were.
Right.
And that's what was happening in Washington, D.C. That's why I authored the D.C. Crimes Act, because the truth of the matter is you got to have a standard when it comes to criminal justice. And if you have that standard and you back law enforcement with that standard, that's how you have safe streets and safe communities. I wouldn't argue today, and neither would you, that the Florida system of law, which has been in place since I moved to the state 30 years ago, has allowed for juvenile crime to run rampant. But in Washington, D.C., it is running rampant. And furthermore, not just with juvenile crime, with people between the ages of 18 and 25 years old, it's running rampant. That's why we authored the D.C. Crimes Bill, passed out of committee in the Oversight Committee, passed on the floor of the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. And I would argue my critics who want to talk about that bill and want to have this false claim of hypocrisy, they say that because they want soft on crime policies in DC. They do not like the fact that President Trump has actually put in the policies that has made the nation's capital safe once again. I
want you to talk for a second about, when you faced, because I want to talk about your redemption arc, because when you faced that time when you were 18, 19, 20 years old, it almost seems as if the first 2 decades of your life are very different from the second 2 decades. So I want you to sort of say, what do you think was the critical moment in that? And I know that from looking at some interviews, you talk about meeting and the influence that your current wife, Erica, has on you. Talk to me about how that change came about.
Well, look, at 20, I was at a real depth in my life. I was at the bottom. And I remember very clearly, I was sitting in the room one day looking up, and I said, I don't know how I got here, but I'm going to make sure that I'm never here again. And so after that point, every decision I made was about being a better man than I was before. It was about being a father to the kids that I knew I would have in the future, and being a quality husband to my wife and a leader in my community. All things that have occurred. At 21, I gave my life to Christ. It's a story out there. I've talked about it before. I actually gave my life to Christ at Cracker Barrel when I was at work. But before giving my life to Christ, the person who got me going to church was my wife now, my girlfriend at the time, Erica Lees, now Erica Donalds. And so the redemption story first was acknowledging that I was making a lot of terrible decisions as a young man, as a young kid, and that I had to do better for myself. The second was acknowledging that God is there for us every step of the way if you trust Him. And so I started going to church, and the rest is history.
I don't want to make too much of this, but it's a fact. You would be the first Black Republican governor of a southern state.
Yes.
Where does race come? Where does that notion that you would be the first Black Republican of a southern state Does that enter into your thinking at all? Do you think? I mean, obviously, you've lived your entire life as being black. I get that answer.
It's a thing, yeah.
But do you recognize that this would be significant?
I'm aware of it, but I don't really focus on it. Actually, in this entire time in politics, I've not really focused on race as a marker. You know, in Florida, Southwest Florida in particular, but Florida overall, we're a meritocracy. We're one of the great meritocracies in not just America, but in the world. And so I think it's not so much about my race. I think it's more about the policies I support, the principles I stand for, common sense conservative policies that have made Florida the envy of the other 49 states in the union.
Do you think that you had an advantage of moving up in the Republican Party because you're black, because that you're someone who the Republican Party would want to champion to show their diversity?
No. And I'll tell you, actually, this race has been a little different for governor, but in any of the other campaigns I've been a part of, I was always the underdog. That's why this one's a little different. I was always the underdog. Never really the choice of donors, never really the choice of a lot of the traditional segments of the Republican Party. I came up through the Tea Party movement. I was a Tea Party activist, a frontline conservative. So the Tea Party movement was my first strong political base, still is to this day. And I think what really happened, whether it was my race for state house or races for Congress, it was that people would hear me talk about the issues of the day, my focus on conservative principles, and not just the principles today, but also the philosophy of why conservatism is the policy set that has freed so many people from bondage. It's the things that has led to economic liberty, economic growth for so many Floridians, so many Americans, and people who choose to make America their home legally, and why it's the best principle set for the future of our country.
I'm not going to ask you if you've experienced incidents of racism, because I think that'd be a dumb question. I'm more curious as to how you deal with incidents of racism, and are there any that stand out since you've been, as an adult here in Florida?
Yeah, there's a couple that stand out, but let me be very clear. The vast majority of our people respect people based upon who they are, how hard they work, what they stand for, and do they have alignment with those values and those beliefs. And at that point, people don't really care about your color. They just want to know, do I agree with you? Are you going to stand for the things that I stand for?
But is there an incident that sticks in your mind, that will always be in your mind, that occurred to you?
I mean, yes. I was getting petitions signed when I was running for a state representative. And I remember I was at a local fair, and I walked up to two gentlemen, and I said, hey, would you sign a petition for me? And one of the gentlemen just looked at the petition and wouldn't even look me in the eye. The other one glanced at me and looked off and said, no, I'm not interested in doing any of that. And at that point, I could pretty much tell, like, okay, this isn't about being a Republican, this isn't about anything else. But I would also tell you, Jim, that is one thing that just remained in my mind. But as I crisscross the state today, I've been in 54 of the 67 counties already. The people of Florida are awesome. I was in Suwannee County 2 nights ago. I was in Monroe County yesterday. I'm here in Miami today. People of Florida, what they want to make sure is that Florida remains on the trajectory it's going. They love the free state of Florida.
And last question about this, only because your wife is white. Have you experienced any backlash as a result of that, marrying a white woman, or has your wife experienced any of it from marrying an African American man?
No, I think people, especially today in today's America, people just want to make sure that you're just going to be a good family, good husband, and raise good kids.
You know, there are some in the black community who may criticize you for marrying a white woman. Have you dealt with that? I
mean, they don't criticize Kamala Harris.
Fair point. All right, I'm going to get to issues, but you're running to replace Ron DeSantis. I'm fascinated by the dynamic between you and the current governor. It seemed like for a long time you and he were strong allies, and then something happened. And I think it basically comes down to you endorsing President Trump and not him when he was running for the White House. How would you describe your relationship to Ron DeSantis?
It's been better, but I think it's something where you can find ways to come back together and work about what we're going to do for the future of our state.
What do you think his biggest mistake has been as governor?
He's actually done a great job. To be honest with you, Jim, I think he's done a great job. I think being in leadership is tough. When you're the person that has to make the decisions, it's hard, and it's really about just making sure I think you get as much information and input as you can. But you can't really second guess somebody who's been in that position because you've not been in that position.
Does it bother you that so many of his senior advisors, or several of his senior aides, were found to have actually be giving advice to and helping your opponent, James Fishback, someone who has been using a virulent and basically a racist attack against you, and yet there are the governor's aides who have been seen helping him and who they admit were helping him for a time.
One thing people need to understand is that the internal politics inside of political parties is probably far more vicious than the things that happen between Republicans and Democrats and independents. Look, when you get into this business, you better have Kevlar skin. Not thick skin, Kevlar skin. And so I think that's something where, if the governor chooses to deal with that, he will with his people and his team. We stay focused on just campaigning, working hard, earning the votes of the people of Florida, because at the end of the day, that's what matters.
What do you think of James Fishback's attacks on you?
Honestly, I just think it's somebody trying to get more attention than anything else. So I really don't pay much attention to him. I don't pay much attention to anybody else who's running. How I've always done my campaigns, Jim, is I stay focused on what I'm doing. I go meet the people that I'm asking for their vote for. We talk about the issues that are important to them. You can't get caught up in the distractions. You can't get caught up in what other campaigns are doing. Half the time, other campaigns just want to get you distracted. So you lose focus on what you're doing. And I would argue if people, looking at polling, looking at other metrics of campaigns, I think the strategy of just ignoring the noise and ignoring other people who just want attention has actually worked out to my benefit.
So let's talk about some of those issues. What do you think is the number one issue facing Floridians?
Well, there's two big ones. The number one doesn't really show up in polling, and that's where the people of Florida want our state to remain on the trajectory that it's been going. Governor DeSantis has done a tremendous job leading our state. And so our voters are saying, we like where it's going. Can we keep it going in that direction? They have my 100% commitment. The same policies, the same common sense conservatism that Governor DeSantis brings to the job is something I bring to the job. And here's why. I'm a member of the House Freedom Caucus in Washington, similar to Governor DeSantis. If you look at my voting record, I have one of the most conservative voting records in America, not just at the federal level, but also at the state level. And so when that's your baseline philosophy, I think that's an indicator of that Florida is going to continue in the same common sense conservative way. But the other big issue, obviously, is affordability. We have young people who are trying to figure out how they're going to afford a home of their own. We have seniors on fixed income trying to figure out how they're going to deal with insurance. And so what we're going to look at is tackling insurance, making sure that we continue to lower property insurance rates in our state, working off of the reforms that Governor DeSantis put into place a couple of years ago. And obviously with property taxes, we'll see what the governor and the legislature get to.
I want to get to that, but I just you used the word affordability.
Yes.
I seem to remember the president saying that affordability was a hoax and that affordability wasn't really an issue, that he had beaten and won for affordability. You still acknowledge that affordability is an issue for people in Florida?
Affordability has been an issue across the country, but let's be clear about what President Trump was saying. What President Trump was saying is that the Democrats caring about affordability is a hoax. Because Democrat policy created this, Jim. I was in the budget committee when Joe Biden was bringing his plans for budget reconciliation. And you could clearly read their bills and know what was going to happen is you were going to create a labor shortage in the United States that was going to lead to significantly higher prices. That's exactly what happened. You had Larry Summers, who was President Obama's chief economist at the time, was saying that this is policy that's not needed. It was going to create inflation in the United States. So what President Trump is talking about is that Democrats all of a sudden who care about affordability are lying to the American people. That's like the arsonist trying to be the firefighter. It just doesn't work.
All right, I want to go back to property taxes.
Sure.
You sort of said a second ago that you'll see what comes out of the legislature. You're going to inherit this. Whatever the legislature decides and voters approve in November is going to be affecting how you run the next 4 years if you're elected governor.
Yes.
Do you have a plan for what you would like to see done on property taxes?
Well, I agree with the governor that we need to repeal homestead property taxes. Property taxes in our state, especially for Floridians, has doubled in the last decade. In the last 5 years, local government budgets have grown massively out of control. The dodging efforts that the CFO and the governor are doing right now are critical for the future of our state. We're going to continue those dodging efforts, and it's going to be for every form of government in the state of Florida, including the state of Florida and state agencies. Everybody has to be examined examined. Everybody's got to tighten their belts, because the people in our state, those who are working hard every single day, are seniors who are trying to find ways to keep their Florida dream alive, and our young people who are trying to get into the Florida dream, they don't have the cash. So we have to do this. And then the key thing is, how do you cut these budgets while making sure that sheriffs still get paid, that deputies still get paid, that firefighters still get paid, you take care of roads, you take care of land management issues. That's the balance that we're going to have to
I just
strike.
want to be clear, because when you make a statement like you want to end all homesteaded property taxes, does that include homesteaded property taxes that go to school districts?
Yes, and then we talk about
school districts.
And let me talk about school districts now. The biggest people who've actually increased property taxes on the hardworking men and women of our state are school districts. But let's also acknowledge the reality, Jim. Miami-Dade Public Schools, their populations are decreasing. Same in Broward County, same in Hillsborough County, same in Collier County where I live, Lee County, Florida, etc. And the reason why their populations are decreasing is because of universal school choice, which the legislature finally passed a couple years ago, which is something I fully support. I've been a school choice champion and advocate my entire time in politics. That's not going to change. But the fiscal reality is that the school districts have less students today than they did when we passed universal school choice, yet at the same time, their budgets have expanded because they're collecting far more property taxes than they ever have.
I want to drill down on this a little bit more, just because you made a statement talking about the CFO and the governor's DOGE efforts. Mm-hmm. Part of what has never been really understood during that is that the state of Tallahassee has a real habit of transferring burdens onto local governments, cities and counties, and telling them, okay, now you pay for this. That's one of the reasons why those state budgets, or why those county and city budgets, municipal budgets have gone up. There's also was no analysis that the DOGE folks did in Florida as to where that money was spent or how it was being spent, whether or not it was being spent to provide new services. I'm just curious, it sounds great to tell people we want to do away with your property taxes and we're not going to affect sheriffs or police officers. I don't know how you can do that without affecting a lot of services, including police and fire. But how do you pay for roads? How do you pay for parks, libraries? Aren't all those issues that are important to people?
They are all important and they're all critical. But let's talk about DOGE first, and I'll come to the key services you're talking about. When it comes to DOGE, they are starting this process of examining all these budgets. I'm aware of the governor and the CFO's formula. It's a good formula to start with. What we want to do is say, let's take that formula as a baseline and then do a 5-year running analysis of every budget in our state, examining line items, and then making sure that the public is aware of where to find all this information so they can examine it in real time and talk to their local officials. Jim, this was what I did for my career. I spent 17 years in banking, insurance, and financial services. So if you're going to talk about long-run financial analysis, which is what DOGE essentially is, then this is one of the reasons why I'm uniquely suited to be Florida's next governor.
So a lot of smaller counties could not survive without those property taxes. The governor has talked about creating a plan where he would establish a pool of money to basically have state tax dollars supplement some of the smaller counties. Is that something you would want to do?
It remains to be seen. There's a lot of details in that have to be broken out. One of the things I'm excited for in this proposal from the Governor DeSantis is when he releases his full plan of how this is all going to come together. The legislature,
but he hasn't. That's the problem. He hasn't released a plan.
Hold on a second. But Jim, hold on a second. In a couple of weeks, the legislature is going to be back in special session to deal with this question. What I fully anticipate is that at that point, the governor is going to release his plan with the details of how all this is going to come together. And hold on, Jim.
He's been talking for a year.
But Jim, you got to give the governor the opportunity to release his plan before you render judgment. Here's what I'm telling the people of Florida. If they're not successful in Tallahassee, I don't anticipate that, but if they are not successful, we are going to pick up the ball in my first year of governor and get that done. And the other thing that we're going to do is we're going to make sure we're talking through the details for the fiscally constrained counties, a lot of them in North Florida, trying to figure out how this is going to work. For the counties like Miami-Dade, for Hillsborough County, Broward County, and Palm Beach, so that we understand where the revenues are going to come from, or quite frankly, how much we actually need to pay for the essential services that we were talking about in your previous question. We want to make sure that the plan that gets put in place is going to actually end homestead property taxes in a way while we keep the services we need for the state of Florida. And by the way, Jim, even if the math doesn't get there, we still have seniors who are struggling to make ends meet. They bought their house or their condo in the 80s moving to Florida, and their property tax bills have gone through the roof. We have young people in our state trying to get started with their dream here in Florida, and even to get to the closing table, the property tax bills are too high. Even just get to pay the escrow to actually close on the home. So there's a way to do this. I would tell you the two populations we definitely want to make sure are getting the most relief possible: seniors who are on fixed income, young people trying to get started.
All right, you mentioned charter schools before. I'm going to jump ahead to my question on charter school.
Sure.
There's a policy now in Florida to where if a school district school is because of declining population, has free space, that charter schools can lay claim to some of those classroom space and operate in them. I think people think that that's generally a good idea. One area though that I'm curious as to your view on is, a lot of the times they're being run by management companies that are for-profit. The charter schools, I understand themselves, are non-profit, but there's plenty of money going here. Should those charter schools or the management companies that operate them pay the school districts, since they're using classrooms, since they're using libraries, cafeterias, using their janitorial services to help clean up the school? Should the charter schools have to pay some negotiated fee to the school districts for the use of those classrooms?
I think something can be negotiated, but let's acknowledge that when school districts collect property taxes, that is for the education of children, the facilities for these children in the community that they're in. Miami-Dade collects property taxes from every resident for public school buildings and facilities. So this isn't money that the school districts just have of their own volition. They didn't create this money out of thin air. They tax the people of Florida in order to have money to house students for the purpose of education and to pay for the physical plant and the maintenance of these facilities. So could something be negotiated? Sure, of course.
Should something be negotiated?
I think so. I think something should be negotiated. I think something could be negotiated. But let's be also very clear. I don't think it's right for school districts to go to charter schools and say you have to pay market rents, because let's be honest, the school district isn't paying market rents. They're taxing citizens to get that money to pay for education, and that's what we want to do as a society, but that is taxpayer money. It is not school district money.
You said, obviously, you've been a major proponent for charter schools for a long time, school
Yes.
choice. Your wife is also very involved in it, has been for a long time.
Yes.
Used to serve on a school board, has operated certain management companies, and is involved. I think in one of your disclosure forms, you had said in recent years she has made more than $1 million in salary and other benefits from her time working for companies related to charter schools. If you're elected governor, will your wife continue to operate businesses related to charter schools and schools in general? Do you see that as a potential conflict of interest?
Oh, well, let's address the last part of your question. My wife is actually not really managing those schools anymore. She started those schools. Those management contracts have been turned over to other entities. My wife, who's a businesswoman, not just education, my wife was a CFO, Chief Financial Officer, and a Chief Compliance Officer for an investment management firm out of New York. She did that job, worked her way up from the bottom like a lot of people did. She's a professional, she's a businesswoman. We are going to make sure, number one, that she's not going to have any businesses with the state of Florida. That's not going to happen. Number two, we will comply with all laws, and we will make sure that there are clear boundaries for what my wife's businesses are versus my responsibility of governing the state of Florida.
So you envision that she will continue to have some role in the business community. She's not just going to be First Lady. She's actually going to continue to have a career in which she's working for companies, and you're saying that those companies will not have business with the state of Florida?
Yeah, those businesses will not have, her businesses will not work with the state of Florida. I want to be very clear on that. That is not going to happen because obviously that just doesn't look good, Jim, and we're not going to do that. The second thing is my wife is a professional. She's an accountant by trade. Like I said, she was a chief financial officer for an investment firm. She's a very accomplished woman. I mean, honestly, I'm lucky. You know, I kind of hit the jackpot in the game of life with my wife, Erica. She's awesome. Also, I would tell you, this might be the first time in Florida history where the First Lady is a professional who owns businesses. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's something to be celebrated.
I want to talk about data centers for a second.
Yeah.
That's become an issue that 2 years ago, if you'd asked about data centers, nobody would know what you were talking about. Now it's suddenly become a major topic here in Florida, and I think it's going to be an increasing topic here in this race. You were recently supported by a PAC, the Leading the Future PAC, that has promised $5 million to support your governor's campaign. because they want more data centers being built. There are obviously issues related to those data centers in terms of electricity and their use of water. And the DeSantis administration is right now trying to push for having a lot of regulation on those data centers. Talk to me about your vision for how data centers fit into the future of Florida.
Well, two things. I want to make sure we talk data centers, but then I also want to talk AI, because I think a lot of times the two get confused and conflated. With data centers in particular, my position is similar to President Trump's position. He announced it the other day. Data centers need to be able to generate their own power on site. I think that's important. We don't want to see electricity bills for the people of Florida go up because of new AI data centers, hyperscale data centers in the state of Florida. Number two, with water. The new designs for a lot of these centers are actually significantly better with water usage. We want to make sure that we're protecting Florida's environment. When I was in the State House and also in the U.S. House, I've always supported the funding necessary for the Central Everglades Restoration Plan, and also for protecting Florida's environment. We want to make sure that if these centers are built in Florida, that they're still protecting Florida's environment. So that's data centers. Is there a pathway to do it in our state? Yeah, but there are two lines that have to meet. We got to make sure are handled.
Before you move to AI,
Sure.
I just want to drill down on one of the points you said,
Sure.
producing electricity.
Yes.
I think that you've talked about before about increasing the use of small modular nuclear reactors.
Yes.
So you envision a scenario in which the state of Florida will get more aggressive in terms of building new nuclear facilities in the state?
I think so. It's without question. The future of any economy always is based on power. If you have baseload power, you can grow an economy. If you don't have baseload power, your economy shrinks. We were talking about affordability earlier. Well, if Florida doesn't address its future power needs, how are we going to have the jobs for the young people who want to build their dream in Florida? It just doesn't come together, Jim. So we are going to have to address baseload power. And let me be also clear, solar plants and wind farms do not address baseload power. That's intermittent at best. It's far more expensive. It doesn't decrease the per kilowatt hour that every Floridian's going to have to pay. So we do need small modular reactors. We need them.
When you talk about building nuclear facilities,
Yes.
it can scare some people. It can also concern some people as to what regulations are going to be surrounding them and all those sorts of things. Talk to me about what protections are there going to be when you start talking about building small nuclear reactors around the state?
Jim, these are the same
being built by private companies, by the way, for their data centers.
Understood, Jim. Listen. This is the same technology that has been sitting on our nuclear subs for the last 80 years in the United States of America. And our Navy men weren't coming home with green eyes and yellow hair. Well, except if they were blonde, they probably had yellow hair. But nobody was coming home with green eyes. The same nuclear reactors that are in the belly of every nuclear sub in our fleet is the same technology around small modular reactors and micronuclear reactors. The Department of War is looking at this right now in terms of trying to figure out how to facilitate power needs if there's a forward operating base or for national emergencies. This is energy, quite frankly, that the United States, we were the pioneers of this through the Manhattan Project. We should be leveraging this for the future of our state. So if you want to talk about data centers and making sure people don't have to come out of pocket for more in their electricity bills, I think small modular nuclear reactors are an answer to that question. Real quick, I do want to touch AI because there's two.
But I want to get to the Everglades as well.
Of course.
So go ahead.
Now, when we talk AI, the key thing that we also have to acknowledge is we want to make sure that young kids are protected. We don't want to have large language models that are just open to children with impunity. We've already seen some of the tragedies associated with that. I think the governor had a roundtable discussion with parents who lost their child to suicide because of AI. But at the same time, we cannot hide from the next wave of innovation in our economy. We are now stepping into the next wave of innovation the same way we stepped into it with the internet, the same way we stepped into it with email, the same way we stepped into it with fax machines, word processors, or even the internal combustion engine. These next waves in our economy happen periodically in a growing economy. And I believe if we leverage AI, it's not going to be the same pie economically. I think leverage AI increases productivity, and what that does is expands the economic pie.
I want to turn to the Everglades and the restoration that you're going to inherit. There was a major reset 8 years ago when Governor DeSantis ran in the primary against Adam Putnam. And one of the things that he did, in addition to getting Donald Trump's endorsement, was rail against Adam Putnam for being in the pocket of Big Sugar and attacking sugar. And for the past 8 years, we've seen Big Sugar, Florida Crystals and U.S. Sugar, really sort of sidelined in a way that they've never really been before.
Right.
Do you think Governor DeSantis went too far in his attacks on Big Sugar? And what would your relationship be? Understanding you do take some sugar money, but not necessarily, I know it's not a lot, but you do take sugar money.
Well, listen, Jim, actually, I have people who are in the environmentalist community who support me in my race for governor. I have people in the agriculture community who support me in my race for governor. My commitments are the same I had when I'm in Congress, like I was in the State House when Congressman DeSantis became Governor DeSantis. I fully support Central Everglades restoration. We are going to get that work done in my time as Florida's next governor. We're going to finish that once and for all. I think it's important when we look at water. We talked power, let's talk water. When we look at water, there are many constituencies, the agriculture community, and also people who live in Florida who want fresh drinking water. And so what we're going to do is make sure that we finish that plan, but then we're also going to do an evaluation of fresh water needs in the future of our state, how we're going to manage wastewater going forward in the future of our state. I know most people don't like talking about wastewater treatment. It's a big deal, kind of a smelly topic, but you got to deal with it.
What are we going to do about the discharges going into Lake Okeechobee from the north? Because we're focused on cleaning the water that comes out of Lake Okeechobee as it heads south for the drinking water that we're going to use here right now. But what about the discharges into Lake Okeechobee that's coming from the agriculture communities and from everything south of Disney?
Well, let's be clear. Central Everglades restoration deals with the entire system from the headwaters in Orlando all the way through the Kissimmee River Basin, where a lot of our cattle farmers and ranchers are, and then into Lake Okeechobee. So it's all a comprehensive plan. We're going to finish all that work. When we finish that work, what the studies are demonstrated already is that you're going to see lower phosphorus content, lower nitrogen content moving through the system, and that you actually have the stormwater treatment areas south of Lake Okeechobee. Part of it is the new reservoir that's going to be finished very, very shortly, where then you have clean water, fresh water, actually moving through the Everglades system into Florida Bay and throughout South Florida.
I'm very appreciative of your time, and I know I'm pushing it, but there's just two things I want to get to very quickly.
Of course, go ahead.
Vaccinations.
Yes.
Florida law currently requires immunizations for polio, diphtheria, measles, rubella, whooping cough, and mumps for entry and attendance in Florida schools.
Yes.
The DeSantis administration has been advocating doing away with those requirements. What is your position when it comes to vaccinations for school kids?
Well, there's two sets of vaccinations. One are the vaccines that have come in through rulemaking that have not gone through a legislative process. I agree with the governor and the Surgeon General that list of vaccines in the rulemaking process should be informed consent for parents. The core vaccines that you listed, the biggest ones among them, polio and MMR, I still believe that those should be requirements to attend schools. I do. I think the bigger issue for a lot of mothers in particular who are concerned about vaccines is how the vaccine schedule has just been overloaded on infants the second they come into the world. I have 3 sons, so this is something that my wife and I have looked at personally. The vaccination schedule for my 22-year-old son was not as impactful as the vaccine schedule for my 14-year-old son. So I think in part we should spread out that vaccination schedule. There are some core vaccines like polio and MMR that I think are important. Frankly, in Southwest Florida, there's a measles outbreak right now.
Yeah.
There's one happening right now. So I think MMR is important to continue. These are things that myself and the legislature will go through, and it will be based upon the information and the data, not just historically, but the stuff today as well.
Would you keep Latipo? You wouldn't keep Latipo as your Surgeon General, would you?
It's possible. I mean, look, I know Dr. Latipo. He's done a very good job for the state of Florida. But let's actually be focused on the campaign and win first, and then we'll talk about that.
Last question I'm gonna ask, and I promise, because I'm getting.
I know. It's fine.
It's fine. But we are sitting in Congressional District 27, which has the highest number of Obamacare recipients in the United States. For healthcare in Florida, basically, my understanding is currently there is about 2.5 million people. A little more than 1 in 10 Floridians are without health insurance.
Right.
You voted in the Big Beautiful Bill to end the subsidies, and I don't want to get into a debate about the Obamacare subsidies, but you're going to inherit 2.5 million people who do not have insurance, including hundreds of thousands of children. What do you think you could do as governor to help them?
A number of things. One, we're going to have to look at how we deliver health care in the state of Florida. The truth is that the federal government's not going to be able to fund this long term because the amount of debt the nation is carrying is getting too high, and interest on the debt is crowding out everything else. So Florida is going to have to redevelop health care delivery. We're going to have to be far more efficient. The things that the president is talking about now with Trump RX, getting lower prescription drugs for the people of America, which includes Florida, is a major step forward. Most favored nation status, going along those lines, major step forward. We want to continue the work that Governor DeSantis has done on that in Florida. The other key thing is going to be about efficiencies in healthcare. We have to make sure that we have a system of wellness, and I believe Florida can create that. But specific to subsidies, and I don't want to get into the subsidies fight, we have to acknowledge that the Unaffordable Care Act that was passed by congressional Democrats and then President Obama was designed for premiums and deductibles to continue to rise in private markets so you would funnel people into a public system. And public universal health care has never worked in any country in the world because it takes far too long to get the care that you need, and the services are limited.
There's some countries that would disagree with you.
Those countries would disagree with me, but their people come to the United States to get their health care, and that's a fact.
All right. I really should end it here because otherwise I'm going to get in trouble with your folks. But I hope we can continue this conversation another time.
Anytime, Jim.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.